There are parties where you are invited not to celebrate, but to witness your own exclusion from the real table. I realized that the moment I saw the sender's name on the email, Harper Donnelly, with a subject line that simply read, Friday night, wine and pitch. No formal invitation, no detailed office location, just a smiling wine glass emoji. I had been working at Veritas Insight for more than 12 years, surviving 3 mergers, 2 restructurings, and 1 near bankruptcy. I was never the fastest speaker in the room, nor the name most mentioned in media campaigns, but the work I did kept the company from falling apart. I am Charli D'Amelio, not a dancer, not a hot face. I was the one behind those so-called brilliant comebacks that clients thought came from the stars on stage. I was the one who rewrote the entire brand process when we lost 3 major clients in just 6 months. The one who stayed until the end when the creative team fell apart. The one who chose to stand behind the logo to make sure the company still had a place in the industry. I did not stay with Veritas because I believed in fairness. I believed in systems, in the idea of real value that would, if given enough patience, reveal itself beyond all the flashy lights. At Veritas, I was not a star. I was the structure, and I never thought someone would try to remove a part of the foundation until Harper arrived. Harper Donnelly, daughter of Doug Donnelly, the company's founder, fresh from a prestigious university, bringing along trendy buzzwords like emotional marketing, digitizing belief systems, optimizing brand journeys. She spoke eloquently, so fluently that even I sometimes felt what I was doing had become outdated. Harper never said anything offensive directly, but the way she placed her hand on people's shoulders, as if choosing where to redraw the map, made it clear to me that I was just an old coordinate waiting to be erased. The party was held on the top floor in what used to be the lighting studio of the design department. Now it had been converted into an inspiration space. Doug stood next to Harper, the two of them smiling at every guest as if introducing a perfect heir. When I entered, Harper smiled as she always did. Charli, it is so good to have you here. I am really looking forward to hearing thoughts from those who laid the first bricks. I nodded slightly and sat down at the far end of the table. The soft yellow light cast a glow on the wine glass in my hand. The atmosphere felt like an internal pitch session, except this time no one needed my opinion. After presenting the new vision, Harper moved to the next slide. On the screen appeared a series of visuals for the new campaign titled Veritas Reimagined. A campaign that retold the company's founding story from a fresh perspective, carried out by a young creative team bursting with bold energy. I waited, a line mentioning the old team, a word of thanks for those who had worked late into the night, perfecting every line of copy. Nothing. Harper simply said, "We believe that moving forward requires the courage to remove what is outdated." Doug nodded. Then he looked at me, his eyes lacking the familiar glint. Charli was part of the toughest period when the company was on the brink, but now it is time to move ahead. I said nothing. I looked at Harper standing there, beautiful, confident, proudly presenting a campaign in which I recognized every detail. The rebranding initiative, from the ground up, was a proposal I had made when I noticed clients no longer correctly identifying the old logo system. I was the one who wrote the positioning message redefining Veritas as a strategic partner, not just an advertising agency. I had built the content framework for last month's pitch, the same framework Harper now presented as the young leadership team's new vision. No one in that room knew it. Or if they did, they said nothing. As I stood up to leave, Harper called after me, "Charli, you will still stay with us, at least in an advisory capacity for the transition, right?" I paused. "I was never asked about a transition," I replied. She tilted her head and smiled the way you might smile at an elder being just a little too stubborn. This is a strategic move. It will be good for you. We want to maintain the image of a united, inspiring Veritas." I did not answer. I simply turned and walked down the stairs, feeling as if I were falling from a floor I had once believed I belonged to. The next morning, I received an internal memo. Restructuring announcement: Charli D'Amelio will no longer hold the position of brand content director. We are grateful for her tireless contributions over the past decade. No reason given, no time frame, no word from Doug. I sat in front of the screen, my hand resting lightly on the mouse. In my mind, there was only a faint sound, like the soft click of a door closing behind me. I did not feel sad. I did not cry. I simply felt that the foundation I had built my beliefs on had finally crumbled. On the day I left the office, no one stood at the door. Louise had left a post-it note on my desk. "I am sorry. There are many things I cannot control." I nodded slightly, even though she was not there. I walked down the familiar hallway, past the posters of projects I had run from concept to completion, now hanging silently, as if they had nothing to do with me. No one from the old company texted. No one defended me. The solid relationships I had believed I built fell silent, as if they had never existed. I once thought loyalty was a kind of asset. But it turns out in this industry, when trust is lost, there is no warning, only a formal announcement. That evening, I sat in my small kitchen, staring at the streetlights casting shadows onto the table where my laptop still sat open. Out there were the congratulatory articles celebrating a new generation leading Veritas into the digital era. I read each line, not looking for my name, just to be sure they had truly erased it. A small line in an interview with Harper made me pause. "We have shifted the old mindset into emotional marketing to connect more deeply with users." I laughed quietly. I had been the first to suggest that approach during a nonprofit project where we told the story of a single mother making handmade candles to fund her son's education. The story had been shared widely as a model of authentic success through emotional connection. Now it was being used as an example of a new philosophy, with Harper presenting it. I shut the laptop. The kitchen light remained on, but inside me there was only a vast darkness. At that moment, I was not thinking of revenge. I was only thinking that maybe I had been wrong to believe that if I worked hard enough, people would recognize my true value. But they did not, and they did not need to. They only needed someone newer, younger, more fluent, more dazzling on stage. I was the old part, and old parts, if they do not learn how to survive, will simply be cut away. I picked up my phone, scrolling through my contacts. My finger paused on a name, Daniela. It had been a long time since we had spoken. She had once worked as an internal legal advisor for Veritas during its early days, someone who knew every contract and document when the company first began its privatization process. I did not know why my hand stopped there. Maybe it was just a faint instinct. I did not text. But that night, for the first time in many years, I could not sleep. And in the silence, I knew I had not just lost a job. I had lost a part of my identity that I once thought could never be stolen. I did not get up right away. I did not rush to update my resume or search for new jobs like people usually advise. I let myself sink to the bottom of the silence, not to give up, but to listen more clearly to the echo of my own existence. Some nights, I opened old files, reading through project plans and handwritten notes from years ago. There was a line I once wrote in a campaign for a small cosmetic brand: "Not everyone needs applause. Sometimes you only need a quiet space to hear yourself breathing." I wondered how I had forgotten that. I did not need to prove anything to Harper, to Doug, or to the colleagues who had once worked beside me. What I needed was to reclaim something they had deliberately tried to steal from me: my faith in true value. 1 week after that fateful meeting, I received a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was small but firm. "Charli, this is Daniela. I heard what happened. We need to meet. We arranged to meet at a small cafe near the old district, a place where no one from the industry ever visited. Daniela arrived early. She looked different from 3 years ago, her hair shorter, her gaze no longer sharp and cold like it was when she worked in internal legal affairs, but steadier, calmer. I had not yet said anything when she opened her bag and placed an old file on the table. When I left, I made copies of certain documents, just in case I ever needed to protect my reputation. I never thought it would be for you. I opened the file gently. Inside was the third-year internal shareholding agreement, with an appendix clearly stating any intellectual property developed before the privatization phase belonged to the creator. Signed, Charli D'Amelio. I looked at Daniela. I do not remember signing this. She nodded. You signed it after the team meeting during the Remember Roots humanitarian campaign. Everyone was exhausted back then, just signing whatever was handed to them. I remembered. I remembered that night when I stayed up until 3 a.m. editing just to get the script submitted to the radio station. It turned out the things I thought had been swept away by deadlines had quietly remained more enduring than I had realized. From that day I began to act, not in haste, not loudly. I spent entire days reviewing old system backups from my hard drive, combing through every handwritten line of code I had written to optimize the user feedback reporting platform. It was the same platform Harper had reused almost entirely intact in the new version she introduced as developed from scratch by the young creative team. I found original commit files with timestamps, email confirmations from developers, even snippets of Slack exchanges that I had saved out of habit, afraid I might forget. Every small detail now became a piece of a puzzle that was slowly coming into focus. Alone in my small room with only the glow of the screen and the sound of my own breathing, I began to reconstruct the entire map of a counterattack, bloodless but methodical. On the third evening after meeting Daniela, I received a message from Louise, the only former colleague who still reached out to me. The message was short. Harper is testing the new version of the brand monitoring report, the one you created. There were no other words, but I understood. I understood that everything was moving quickly, and if I did not act soon, the originals would be buried or blurred beyond recognition. I sprang up, reconnecting with Ben, who had once managed the auxiliary data system in Veritas's early days. Ben was still there, quiet and cautious, the kind of person who always kept backup copies of anything that someone might tamper with. I only needed to say, Ben, do you remember the 2017 project feedback tracking system? He did not ask anything else. He just replied with 3 words, still intact. And I knew then that I still had a chance. Even though I was no longer part of the old company, I still held pieces of the foundation they were running on. The things I built were not made to shine, but to endure, and that endurance had never truly vanished. I started redrawing the entire input-output project map, reconnecting with old clients, reopening old newsletters that had once been sent regularly, reading through responses from people who had once called me the heartbeat of the brand. I said nothing to anyone about what I was preparing to do. I simply took notes. I recorded every small error the new system had begun to make because of the lack of foundational rules. I noted every time a client messaged asking, "Where is the former content strategist?" I even recorded instances where at least 3 former partners texted me when they realized Veritas's new campaign was reusing licensed images from my personal projects. Each night I printed out sections of evidence, arranging them into separate groups, each group telling its own story. I was not just reacting to being wronged. I was reconstructing the ecosystem they thought belonged exclusively to them. I did not need to wage war. I only needed to prove that no one could rewrite history by erasing the name of its creator. I still had not spoken to Doug. He did not text. He did not call. There was no apology, no explanation. But I heard that he no longer actively managed operations, appearing only at formal meetings. The more I learned, the clearer it became that Harper now held real power, and his silence spoke volumes. It meant he had chosen to let others dismantle the foundation we once built together. One night, just after I turned off my laptop, the phone rang. It was a male voice, unfamiliar, introducing himself as the partnership manager of an investment fund interested in rebuilding branding models from a human-centered perspective. They had heard about my old handmade brand project and wanted me to share how I had implemented a strategy that touched users emotionally without relying on a large budget. I stayed silent for a few seconds before agreeing to send them the documents. But deep down, I knew something had shifted. I was no longer trapped in the feeling of betrayal. I was no longer waiting for recognition. I was quietly rebuilding piece by piece what was rightfully mine. In the days that followed, I silently reconnected with those I had once mentored. Former employees who were now brand directors at smaller companies. Former collaborators who had left because they could not stand Veritas's new culture. The fragments I thought had scattered turned out to still be there, waiting to be reactivated. No one asked me what I was planning. But the way they responded saying, "I still have the originals," or "You want me to review the old tracking system, right?" told me everything I needed to know. I was no longer alone. And I was not the only one who realized that the new system was slowly losing its way. Silence is a form of strength when you know how to use it at the right moment. And I chose the perfect time to stay silent. No counterattacks, no rebuttals. I said nothing while the other side began to say too much. Leaks are not uncommon in internal affairs, but this time I did not have to lift a finger because Harper's actions began to reveal themselves. She pushed the rebranding based on authentic emotions project, aggressively speaking, at various conferences about how Veritas had shedded its outdated past to step into the digital era. Those words, though, wrapped in creative language, carried a clear implication of denying everything that came before. But Harper forgot that the public sometimes has a long memory, especially the clients who stood with the company through real upheavals, not just those who posed for pictures once the lights were set perfectly. On the second morning of the new week, I received a message from Jared, the head of internal communications. It was not long, just a screenshot from an internal feedback group discussing a suspicious overlap between the new campaign and an old community video from 2019, a script I had once written. The final line of the message was laced with meaning. Seems someone forgot the 2-year usage clause. I reopened my copyright archive and confirmed it. Jared was right. The visuals Harper had reused had expired 6 months ago, and under the terms of the agreement, any reuse required the consent of the original content creator. That creator was me. Harper had not only taken my position, she was now using my work without permission, as if everything that once existed no longer had anyone to protect it. 2 days later, the first post appeared on an industry forum. It did not attack anyone personally, but carefully analyzed how the new campaign bore too many similarities to the old Veritas community campaign, whose original creator was no longer with the company. Public opinion began to stir. It was not loud, but it was enough to force Harper to call an emergency meeting with the legal department. Louise sent me an internal memo titled, "Review of Intellectual Property Use, Clauses Pre-Restructuring Phase." I did not need to read it all to know what it said. Harper was scrambling to legitimize what she had used, realizing too late that the person who wrote those foundations had not vanished, but remained clear-headed and methodical enough to confront every small detail. That same day, I received a call from someone unexpected, Doug. He called from a private number, his voice tired and hoarse, like a man who had not slept. Charlie, I did not know things had gone this far. I said nothing. He continued, Harper, she is trying, but maybe she is not ready yet. I nodded, even though he could not see me. Doug, you are not calling to apologize, so why are you calling? He sighed. I think you might still have some things Veritas needs. That sentence confirmed it. They were floundering, and what worried them was not that I had returned, but that I had disappeared so silently, so deeply, and now reappeared at exactly the right moment. 2 days later, Harper appeared on an industry podcast to share the journey of recreating Veritas. During the Q&A session, a question from the audience made the atmosphere freeze. Can Veritas truly be called reborn if the foundation of its current campaigns was built from someone else's work? Harper smiled lightly and answered, all creativity is inherited as long as the direction is new. That seemingly clever answer was cut out and circulated separately, causing a ripple of controversy within the creative community. People who had worked in the industry began to discuss the old company, about how the builders of the foundations were erased or worse treated as relics that needed to be discarded for the sake of innovation. Daniela called me back that night. They are trying to build an internal file to prove that Harper restructured the foundational system. But if I send you the original system map, you hand drew with internal seals of approval, you can submit a counterclaim to the Intellectual Property Board. I sent it. I sent everything I had kept, everything I once feared might be meaningless. It turned out that my thoroughness, once thought excessive, was now the only reason I could stand against them without raising my voice and still slow down a machine that was running too fast without knowing its way. By the next week, something unexpected happened. A former Veritas client called me directly. Charlie, I just received a new strategy proposal from them, but it looks exactly like the one you pitched 3 years ago for my third brand. They just changed the title. I do not understand. I smiled lightly. You understand already. That call did not end with frustration. He invited me to join a small group, launching a new consultancy, focusing on human-centered branding strategies, prioritizing sustainable relationships over short-term campaigns. I had not given an answer yet, but it was clear to me now those who had known me had not forgotten. Harper could no longer fully control the internal environment. Meetings began to happen without her being invited. Messages stopped following the standard PR scripts. People who had once supported her started to fall silent whenever she spoke at strategic meetings. Doug had almost disappeared from public updates. No one declared anything outright, but I knew they were facing what I had once faced, the silence of doubt. The difference was I walked through it by looking back and gathering while they were trying to erase. And the things you try to erase often come back faster than you expect. I did not feel joy. I did not feel triumph. I simply sat in my small study hand, resting on the file Daniela had returned after completing the legal verification, and replayed an old video clip, one where I had sat at the edge of the stage, fine-tuning every word of a final copy for an inspirational campaign. In the background, there was the sound of Harper laughing back when she was just an intern walking past me and Jared with a coffee in hand. Charlie is the kind of person who does all the work without needing anyone to know. I never needed anyone to know, but no one has the right to forget. There are moments that require no announcement yet. You know clearly you have crossed into a different phase. For me, it was a quiet weekend morning when the sunlight barely slipped through the thin curtains and the coffee beside my right hand had started to cool. I opened my laptop not to check emails or proofread documents, but to write the very first line of a brand new plan meant for no one but myself. I named the file Bridge, rebuilding not from scratch, but from the core. In that moment, I no longer saw myself as someone cast out from the old company. I was someone preparing to begin again, grounded on a foundation I knew better than anyone. News from Daniela's lawyer confirmed that Veritas was conducting a full review of intellectual property assets that had become muddled between company property and personal creations before privatization. The first list they needed to verify was my old strategic proposals. This forced them to reach out, but not with a casual dinner invite or a token advisory offer. This time, it was a formal letter requesting a dialogue, complete with a signature from their legal department. I received it on Monday morning, read it in under 3 minutes, then carefully folded it and placed it in a separate envelope. There was no need to rush. They were waiting for a response from someone they once thought would disappear quietly. But I had learned that some presences do not need to shout. They only need to show up at the right moment. That afternoon, I met with a former partner who had once worked with Veritas, but had since branched out to create a specialized branding solutions network for small and medium businesses. His name was Daniel Renier, someone the industry referred to as the man who rarely appears but is present at every strategic pivot. Daniel greeted me with a slow, unshowy handshake that carried real weight. "Charli," I heard. "Harper is scrambling." I smiled lightly. I am not here to talk about how they are scrambling. I am here to talk about where I am going. Daniel nodded. Good. Because if I am going to invest in anything, it would be preparation, not anger. We spoke for nearly 2 hours. No specific plan was drawn up, but I knew exactly what I needed. I needed a new network, not to retaliate, but to rebuild the model I once dreamed of, but never had the chance to create. A model that put sustainability and humanity at the core, not chasing trends, not burning budgets on gimmicks, but growing alongside clients as partners. I called it authentic emotional marketing, not just storytelling for the sake of selling. Daniel listened carefully, asked deep questions, and when I finished, he simply said, "If you need it, I will be the first to put my team into trial with you." It was not a promise of investment. It was a quiet affirmation that what I carried still had value. No stage required, only certainty. That evening I went home and opened the small black notebook I had kept in the drawer since my days at Veritas. It did not contain plans, only names. The names of people who had once stood beside me when I was worn down. The names of those who had once said, "I will go with you if you ever start something of your own." The names of Ben, of Jared, of Louise, of Daniela. I picked up my pen and marked those who were still there, then added a new name, Daniel Renier. I looked at that list as if looking at a bridge that had almost been completed, only missing one final span. A few days later, I had lunch with Jared. He arrived 10 minutes late, fresh from a meeting with Harper. She is tightening control over communications more than ever, forcing edits on every piece that mentions the pre-transition era. But the design team has started pushing back quietly. Some are sending old versions to clients, saying the new ones have errors. I listened without nodding or shaking my head. Jared took a sip of water and continued, "Some people are waiting for you. They are not saying it out loud, but I see them starting to send briefs to outside agencies, and they are choosing very small ones that work the way you used to." I asked quietly, "If I send a new proposal without my name attached, would you be willing to give honest feedback?" Jared nodded. "I have been waiting for you to ask that." I began rewriting the structure for a new platform. It was not just a service. I wanted to create a system that would connect small creative communities into an ecosystem capable of protecting intellectual property and recognizing the right people for their work. I named the project Lightwell, a narrow shaft of light through a concrete ceiling, just enough for those below to know they were still seen. Over 3 weeks, I worked almost without sleep, reviewing old legal systems and reaching out to parties who shared the same philosophy. Amid all that intensity, I received a short email from Harper. The subject line read, "Only do not escalate this further." I did not reply, but I knew if she had sent that message, it meant what I was doing had begun to affect them. The day I officially sent the intellectual property confirmation letter and requested the termination of all unauthorized reuse, I attached nothing beyond a copy of the original agreement, along with one brief line: "I am not stopping progress. I am protecting what should not be forgotten." That line needed no signature, no defense, but it was enough to force Harper to halt the announcement of their new campaign, which had reused 4 ideas from the old system I had built. That weekend night, I sat on the balcony of my apartment, looking toward the light still shining from the upper floors of the old building where Veritas still operated. I no longer felt bitterness, only a cold clarity. They might not need me anymore, but they could not erase me from the foundation. And when a foundation begins to crack, people will eventually search for the one who first poured the concrete. I did not need to return to be the same person I once was. I was moving forward to become a different version of myself, stronger, sharper, more aware, a version that understood sustainability does not lie in contracts, but in relationships that cannot be faked when the ground starts to tremble. I closed the laptop, stood up, and sent Daniela a short text: "I am ready." On the other side, she replied with just 2 words: "Tomorrow morning." There were no announcements, no grand launch events, no flowers sent, or hashtags celebrating it on social media. But at exactly 9 a.m., that morning, the Lightwell system officially went live, starting with a creative management platform designed specifically for small teams and emerging brands, where they could document their journey of idea development, register, content ownership in real time, and receive direct feedback from a community truly invested in core values, not just looking at impressions. I did not need a large-scale media campaign. I only needed the first group of people to believe in it. And I had them quietly but steadfastly, just as I had passed through my own silent months. 3 days later, Jared sent a short message. She knows, and she's trying to counter it. She didn't need to be named. Harper had begun instructing the internal team to review information about Lightwell, and at the same time, she launched a new service package branded as an ecosystem to protect internal creativity. The naming proposal structure and even the template were so similar that it was clear she hastily constructed it from what Veritas had learned during the years I was there. But this time, no one responded as she expected. No clients called to inquire further. No colleagues reposted her article. Harper was speaking, but no one was listening, not because she had weakened, but because I was no longer the person she pushed back so she could move forward. I had left the old game and started a new one where the rules were no longer written by them. Within 2 weeks, Lightwell received 3 collaboration offers from brands that had been loyal clients of Veritas. They did not make a fuss, did not announce their contract termination, but simply chose not to renew. Then one day, one of the largest brands I had once developed the initial strategy for, called Daniel Renier, directly requesting to meet with the new team they heard, had the same core as the early days, but with an upgraded mindset. Daniel only asked if I wanted to go with him. I nodded. The meeting took place on the 7th floor of an office building nestled quietly in the creative district. The meeting room was simple, but the light was just enough to reveal the expressions of those seated across from me. I did not give a long presentation. I simply opened a development map of the brand's progression in stages each, with notes about content ownership, emotional feedback cycles, and how to design messages without relying on cliches. When I finished speaking, no one clapped. They simply exchanged looks and turned to Daniel, nodding lightly. "Start as soon as possible." The day rumors began to spread that Harper had lost her executive position. I was sitting in a small cafe with Louise, who had quietly kept track of everything from within. She set her phone down on the table and said softly, "Doug just signed the decision to return Harper to a secondary advisory role. Celeste will temporarily take over until they appoint a permanent replacement." I didn't ask further questions. Louise looked at me for a moment and then smiled gently. "You don't need to go back, because in truth, everyone is heading in the direction you've already set." I said nothing. I just sipped the cold tea, letting the news wash over me like the wind through an open window. Doug had never called again, nor had he sent any message after the one time he acknowledged Harper is not ready yet. Perhaps he understood that any explanation now would be too late. Some things, once you let someone else take over, can never be redone. Harper still appeared at some industry events, but her gaze was no longer steady. Her voice was still articulate, but it had lost the confidence only those who truly understand the system can possess. Once I ran into her at a seminar. No one introduced us. No one made connections. We simply passed each other, and she looked at me as if waiting for something. I simply nodded. No blame, no greeting, no need to prove who was right or wrong. Because at that moment, what I carried was no longer anger. It was the foundation. And when the foundation is strong enough, it doesn't need to stand tall to hold up a building. I returned to the Lightwell office that afternoon when the sunlight was just enough to cast a long streak along the hallway. Ben was setting up the new security system. Jared was editing content for a new nonprofit brand. Daniela had just sent over the memorandum confirming the approval of the original idea's ownership. No one said much, but the atmosphere in that room was enough for me to know we had done the right thing. No applause, no stage. We were rebuilding in a way no one could erase. At the end of the day, I opened the name notebook again. On the last page, I wrote one more line. Harper, the one who reminded me that foundations only remain solid when you check on them regularly. I didn't write it with bitterness, just as a reminder, because without that push, I might still be sitting in the same old chair, doing the same old things, thinking that staying was a form of acknowledgement. Now I understand sometimes losing a position is the only way to look back and see what you're truly holding on to. 2 months later, an article appeared in an industry magazine titled Redefining Emotional Marketing, Not a Tool, but the Result of Living True to Values. Beneath the article was a note, inspired by the development model of Lightwell, a platform that recognizes true value, protects sustainable relationships, and ensures transparent creative rights. I stopped reading right there. No need to read further, because the first sentence was enough. That night I sat alone on the porch. I didn't open my laptop. I didn't take any more notes. I just listened to the wind rustling through the leaves, the rhythm of the wind, steady like a breath. And in that moment, I understood that silence is not a void. Sometimes it is the foundation upon which the right thing rises at just the right time. I didn't need anyone to apologize. I didn't need anyone to make amends. I just needed to keep building quietly with those who still remembered why I started. Maybe people will forget what you did. Maybe they'll erase your name from a slide. But if what you've built is rooted in true value, it will stand there nameless, making people slow down. Because in the end, true value doesn't need to be pushed to the top. It just needs to endure longer than the things that fade away.